What happens when one of Hollywood's most beloved actors walks into what should be a routine late-night interview, only to discover that the host has prepared an ambush designed to destroy his reputation on live television? Tonight, we're diving deep into the shocking confrontation that left Johnny Depp storming off Jimmy Kimmel's set. And trust me, what you're about to hear will completely change how you see late-night television forever. But before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, telling me which late-night host you think crosses the line most often, because this story is going to blow your mind. The stage was set for what everyone expected to be a light-hearted promotional interview. Johnny Depp had agreed to appear on Jimmy Kimmel Live to discuss his latest film project, something that should have been a straightforward conversation between two entertainment industry professionals. The audience was buzzing with excitement. Phones were recording from every angle, and social media was already lighting up with anticipation of seeing the charismatic actor charm his way through another talk show appearance. But what the audience didn't know, what Johnny Depp didn't know, was that Jimmy Kimmel had spent weeks preparing something entirely different. Behind the scenes, producers had been digging through years of tabloid stories, court documents, and personal controversies, building what can only be described as a character assassination toolkit. The plan was simple but devastating. Turn what should have been a promotional interview into a public interrogation designed to humiliate one of cinema's most iconic figures. As Johnny walked onto the stage that night, flashing his trademark smile and waving to the cheering crowd, he had no idea he was walking into a carefully orchestrated trap. The first few minutes played out exactly as expected, with Jimmy delivering his usual monologue-style banter, and Johnny responding with the kind of witty charm that had made him a household name. The audience was eating it up, laughing at every joke and hanging on every word. But seasoned observers could sense something was off. Jimmy's smile seemed forced, his questions felt loaded, and there was an underlying tension in his voice that suggested this interview was about to take a very different direction. The production crew seemed unusually alert. Cameras were positioned at angles that would capture every facial expression, and you could almost feel the anticipation building among the staff who knew what was coming. Johnny, ever the professional, continued to play along with what he assumed was just Jimmy's particular interview style. He shared anecdotes about his latest project, talked about his approach to character development, and even indulged in some playful back and forth about his various eccentric roles over the years. The audience was thoroughly entertained, completely unaware that they were about to witness something that would become one of the most talked-about moments in late-night television history. The turning point came when Jimmy's questions began to shift from promotional material to personal territory. What started as seemingly innocent inquiries about Johnny's creative process slowly transformed into probing questions about his private life, his past relationships, and controversies that had nothing to do with why he was supposed to be there. Johnny's body language began to change. His responses became more measured, and you could see the confusion starting to creep across his face as he tried to understand why the conversation had taken such an unexpected turn. Jimmy, emboldened by his pre-planned strategy, pushed further. His questions became more pointed, more personal, and increasingly inappropriate for what was supposed to be a light entertainment program. The audience, initially unsure how to react, began to sense the shift in atmosphere. Some continued to laugh nervously while others sat in uncomfortable silence, as they realized they were witnessing something far more serious than typical late-night comedy. What made the situation even more disturbing was how Jimmy seemed to be enjoying the discomfort he was creating. His questions weren't coming from a place of journalistic integrity or genuine curiosity. They were calculated attacks designed to put Johnny in impossible positions and force him to defend himself against accusations and insinuations that had no place in a promotional interview setting. Johnny, despite his growing frustration, continued to try to steer the conversation back to professional territory. He attempted to redirect Jimmy's questions toward his work, his craft, and the project he was there to promote. But every time he tried to move away from personal attacks, Jimmy would circle back with even more invasive questions, creating a hostile environment that was becoming increasingly uncomfortable for everyone involved. The audience began to pick up on the tension, and what had started as enthusiastic cheering gradually turned into confused murmurs and uncomfortable shifting in seats. People were beginning to realize that what they were witnessing wasn't entertainment. It was something much more problematic, and many were starting to feel complicit in what was essentially a public ambush of someone who had come there in good faith. The breaking point came when Jimmy decided to cross a line that should never have been crossed. Instead of backing down when he saw Johnny's obvious discomfort, he doubled down with a question so personal and inappropriate that it sent shockwaves through the entire studio. The question wasn't just invasive, it was deliberately designed to humiliate, and the way Jimmy delivered it, with a smirk that suggested he was proud of his ambush tactics, revealed the true nature of what was happening. Johnny's reaction was immediate and visceral. The mask of professional courtesy that he had been maintaining throughout the increasingly hostile interview finally dropped, and for the first time that evening, the audience saw genuine anger flash across his face. He leaned back in his chair, stared directly at Jimmy, and delivered a response that was both dignified and devastating in its quiet intensity. "You know what, Jimmy?" Johnny said, his voice steady but filled with barely controlled fury. "I came here tonight as a professional courtesy to talk about my work and connect with people who appreciate cinema. I didn't come here to be ambushed by someone who clearly has more interest in tabloid gossip than actual conversation. This isn't journalism, this isn't entertainment, this is just sad." The studio fell completely silent. The audience, many of whom had been growing increasingly uncomfortable with Jimmy's line of questioning, suddenly understood that they were witnessing something unprecedented. This wasn't part of the show. This wasn't scripted banter. This was a real confrontation between two people, and one of them had just been exposed as someone willing to betray professional trust for the sake of ratings. Jimmy, rather than backing down or apologizing for his inappropriate behavior, decided to escalate the situation even further. He began to mock Johnny's response, suggesting that he was being overly sensitive and couldn't handle tough questions. This was perhaps the most revealing moment of the entire confrontation, because it showed Jimmy's complete lack of understanding about the difference between legitimate journalism and personal attacks disguised as entertainment. "Come on, Johnny," Jimmy said with that same smirk. "These are questions that people want answers to. You're a public figure. You signed up for this when you became famous. If you can't handle a few tough questions, maybe you shouldn't be doing interviews." That response demonstrated everything wrong with Jimmy's approach. He was essentially arguing that being a public figure meant surrendering all rights to privacy and dignity, that fame was a license for anyone with a platform to say whatever they wanted, regardless of context or appropriateness. It was a philosophy that revealed a fundamental lack of respect for the people who agreed to appear on his show. Johnny's response was swift and decisive. He stood up from his chair, looked directly into the camera, and addressed the audience with a dignity that stood in stark contrast to his host's behavior. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said calmly, "I want you to remember this moment. This is what happens when someone invites you into their space under false pretenses, then tries to humiliate you for their own entertainment. This isn't what guests deserve, and it's not what audiences deserve either." The power dynamic in the room had completely shifted. Johnny, who had been put on the defensive by Jimmy's ambush tactics, had reclaimed control of the situation through sheer force of character. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't losing his temper. He was simply stating facts with a clarity that made Jimmy's behavior look even more inappropriate by comparison. Jimmy, clearly realizing that his plan had backfired spectacularly, tried to salvage the situation by claiming it was all in good fun and that Johnny was overreacting. But his attempts at damage control only made things worse, because they revealed that he either didn't understand the seriousness of what he had done, or he understood perfectly and was trying to gaslight both his guest and his audience into thinking inappropriate behavior was acceptable. The audience, many of whom had initially been laughing along with Jimmy's questions, were now completely on Johnny's side. You could hear murmurs of support rippling through the crowd, and several people could be seen shaking their heads in disapproval at Jimmy's continued attempts to justify his ambush tactics. The energy in the room had completely changed, and it was clear that Jimmy had lost not just his guest, but his audience as well. What made the situation even more powerful was how Johnny handled himself throughout the escalating confrontation. Despite being ambushed and attacked, despite having his privacy violated and his character questioned, he never lost his composure. He responded to hostility with dignity, to personal attacks with professional courtesy, and to disrespect with a grace that made his host's behavior look even more shameful by comparison. The final moments of the interview became the stuff of television legend. Jimmy, perhaps realizing that his ambush had completely backfired, made one last desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. Instead of apologizing or trying to redirect the conversation back to appropriate territory, he decided to launch into an even more personal attack, bringing up details that had absolutely nothing to do with Johnny's professional work and everything to do with trying to score cheap points at the expense of someone's privacy. Johnny listened to this final assault on his character with the patience of someone who had dealt with far worse than a talk show host having a power trip. When Jimmy finally finished his rant, Johnny simply smiled, shook his head slowly, and delivered what would become one of the most quoted responses in late-night television history. "Jimmy," he said, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge. "I've been in this business for decades. I've worked with some of the most talented, professional, and respectful people in entertainment. I've also encountered people who mistake having a platform for having character, who confuse being given a microphone with having something worthwhile to say. Tonight, I've had the misfortune of sitting across from someone who represents everything wrong with modern media, someone who thinks that being cruel is the same thing as being clever." The audience erupted in applause. Not the polite, expected applause of a television audience, but genuine, enthusiastic support for someone who had just articulated what many of them were feeling. Jimmy's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, anger, and what might have been the beginning of embarrassment, though he quickly tried to cover it with his trademark smirk. Johnny wasn't finished. He turned to address the audience directly, effectively cutting Jimmy out of his own show. "You all came here tonight expecting to be entertained, and instead you've been made witnesses to someone's personal vendetta disguised as journalism. You deserve better than this, and honestly, so do the other guests who come on this show trusting that they'll be treated with basic professional respect." With that, Johnny removed his microphone, set it down on the table with deliberate care, and began to walk toward the exit. Jimmy, panicking at the prospect of his guest leaving before the planned end of the segment, called out after him, trying to convince him to stay and continue the interview. But his pleas fell on deaf ears, and his attempts to frame Johnny's departure as an overreaction only reinforced how completely he had misread the situation. As Johnny reached the edge of the stage, he paused and turned back one final time. The entire studio was holding its breath, waiting to see what he would say. Instead of anger or insults, Johnny delivered a message that was far more devastating than any personal attack could have been. "Jimmy, I hope someday you understand the difference between being a host and being a bully, between asking tough questions and launching personal attacks, between entertaining your audience and exploiting your guests. Until then, I think it's best if we end this conversation." With that, Johnny Depp walked off the Jimmy Kimmel live set, leaving behind a stunned audience, a flustered host, and what would become one of the most talked-about moments in recent television history. The cameras kept rolling as Jimmy tried to salvage the segment, making jokes and attempting to play off what had just happened as no big deal, but his efforts were transparent and desperate. The audience's reaction told the real story. Instead of laughing at Jimmy's attempts at damage control, many people were still applauding Johnny's departure. Others were shaking their heads in disapproval at what they had just witnessed. The energy in the room had completely shifted, and it was clear that Jimmy had lost not just his guest, but the respect of many people who had come to see a good show, and instead witnessed something much more uncomfortable. What made Johnny's exit even more powerful was its restraint. He could have shouted. He could have made personal attacks of his own. He could have turned the situation into a screaming match that would have given Jimmy exactly the kind of dramatic television moment he seemed to be seeking. Instead, he chose a dignity over drama, class over chaos, and in doing so, he exposed the fundamental difference between someone who understands what it means to be a professional and someone who mistakes having a platform for having the right to abuse it. So there, you have it. The incredible true story of how Johnny Depp shut down Jimmy Kimmel's ambush interview and walked off the set with his dignity intact. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of television's most shocking moments, make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest stories. And drop a comment below telling me which celebrity do you think handled a hostile interview better than anyone else? I'll be reading through your responses and might feature some in our next video, so don't hold back, let me know what you think.